All of that, the kind of the Eastern question, which they called it in the 19th century, right, which is how did the European powers carve out the Ottoman Empire? All of that started with Greece. It was the first country. Israel has a vested interest in kind of breaking apart NATO. The easiest place to do that is actually in the rivalry with Greece and Turkey. If you told a Greek in 1800 in Thessaloniki, you're a Greek, people said, no, I'm Rome, right? I'm Eastern Christian. They wouldn't know what you're talking about. Greece was always more linked to the East. They really saw themselves as part of the East.
You try to look at this from like a 500-year perspective, from a bird's eye view. It's so obvious.
You have about 400,000 Muslims living in modern-day Greece who are sent back, ethnically cleansed out of modern-day Greece and sent to Turkey, and about 1.4 million Orthodox Christians living in today modern Turkey who are sent to Greece.
There's this empire,
yes,
and there's lots of trade, and
yes,
there's lots of cultural exchange, and then nationalism comes,
yes,
and then there's, forms of ethnic cleansing,
yes,
forms of migration, forced migration.
It was the secular kind of government of Turkey that persecuted the Christians in Turkey. You had coexistence between Muslims and Christians for centuries under these empires, and that the region itself was very cosmopolitan and very mixed. So the West tried to kind of inflict this kind of other identity and separation on the region. Many of the Greeks at the time, they had the idea that they would take, actually as their leader, another Ottoman Pasha. Everywhere I traveled in the wider Middle East, to Turkey, to Egypt, and to Israel, that kind of these classic occupied Palestine and Israel, it is the Greek community in Israel, which is actually the biggest shell of its former self. In West Jerusalem, you see kind of all these Greek villas and houses that were seized by Zionists.
Yeah, no, he'd be great.
Yeah.
Like, he's actually
and he'd be a fascinating guy. He's one of those guys that you could each do like 10 hours with too, actually, because he's fascinating.
I'll do 1, 2, 3, I'll clap, and then I'll begin. 3, 2, 1. Hi, good day. Welcome to another episode of Unapologetic, and I'm very pleased to welcome to our studio today my own colleague, Sean Mathews. Sean, welcome to the studio.
Great to be here.
Sean, you're here today because you've written this book over here, The New Byzantines, which is about the rise of Greece and the return of the Near East. Now, you have Greek roots, which I've known about, but I discovered more as I was reading through your book. Tell us about the name of the book and what it reveals about the book.
Yeah. So basically what I tried to do with this book, Ishfaq, was write a book looking at how Greece belongs to what I call the wider Middle East, kind of zoning in on that, the Near East, which you can use interchangeably with the Levant, etc. And, for centuries, there's kind of been this like tussle between Greek identity, which is, does Greece belong to the West? Does it belong to the East? So I picked the Byzantines as the kind of the title because this really epitomizes kind of Greece's Eastern identity. It was the Byzantine Empire, which of course was the successor to the Roman Empire. The Byzantine Empire was the Eastern Roman Empire. So following the collapse of Rome in the 400s, the Byzantine Empire continued for another 1,000 years and ruled over the East. So historic Palestine, Egypt, Syria, all of these lands were part of the Byzantine Empire, Turkey. And it was this Byzantine identity, which I argue was kind of, a precursor to the Ottoman Empire. There were great similarities between these two empires that I wanted to tap into and explore today, kind of in the current world that we're seeing. So for me, the Byzantine element to all of this is really speaking towards the Greeks' place in what I call the new Near East and this wider Middle East that's kind of coming back together. It's looking at how the region is going beyond nation states, right? I mean, a lot of people don't think of this because when you think of Greece, you think, okay, it's a country, it's surrounded it's in the European Union, it's in NATO, and it's kind of locked into the West, right? So I tried to kind of pull out this older identity, which is much older than the nation state, which linked Greece to the wider Middle East and today to the Arab world and to the Islamic world, and of course the Orthodox Christian world.
Okay, for me, what is striking about the book is most of us, anyone who gets a Western education, you learn about the Greeks and you see them as the center of Western civilization and the genesis of Western civilization, and then it moves on to the Romans. And so Greece is painted as like the center of the West, right?
Sure.
In the modern education system we have. And I think as you travel through the world, and like it's also interesting because Greece is not like it's right now. It's like this not very powerful country that's quite small, that's sitting, just next to Turkey, has lots of islands. So it also is a bit counterintuitive, but that's okay because that's how the world works. But I think as you travel through the world, and I experienced this while reading your book, it's like the idea initially feels strange. Like, how is Greece not the center of the West? Or because even though I know it's not, like the baggage is still there. But then as you read the book, and you think about your own personal anecdotes, this is like, oh yeah, it's so obvious. It's so obvious that Greece is not part of the Western world. It's something else entirely. And I think, I mean, we want to get into that more, but like the idea that culturally it has so much more in line with the Mediterranean, with the Levant, with the Arab world, with the Turkish world. And I think the name itself, like Byzantines, it's like, that's a fake name. right? In the sense that like they were the inheritors of the Roman Empire, but
Yes.
the West wanted to throw them off, so they called them something else, the Byzantines.
Well, yeah. So the Byzantines never called themselves the Byzantines, right? They called themselves Eastern Romans, and of course they were calling themselves Rome. And even during the Ottoman Empire, the Christian minorities that were living in the Ottoman Empire, whether they were ethnically Greek, Arab, Serbian, they were called Rum actually, which was a throwback to the Roman Empire, so the Eastern Roman Empire. So yeah, the people that we think of as the Byzantines today, they didn't call themselves Byzantines, they called themselves Eastern Romans. I mean, they were the Roman Empire. But basically what I tried to do with the book is show that, as you're saying, right, that this country that is, people think it's associated with the West, it's really not. And I would say this, is that it's the West that imposed a Western identity on Greece. So Greece is really the first country where we see the West kind of coming in, much like ancient Egypt, kind of like Egyptology and kind of this fascination with ancient Egypt that spurred in the West during the time of colonialism. When kind of 17th and 18th century travel writers were starting to come to the Mediterranean, they were really going back to this ancient Greek identity, the Hellenic period, right? And they were like, okay, this is the birthplace of democracy, Plato, Aristotle, and they were kind of saying like, this is where we got our traditions from, because they kind of drew that back. But basically what I say is that Greece was always more linked to the East. They really saw themselves as part of the East. And one of the reasons why it's a travel book more than anything else is that I had to show that in the book. And I had to show that, Greeks were not just kind of boxed into what is today considered the European Union, let's say, but they were scattered all over the Levant. So of course, I went to cities like Istanbul, I went to Jerusalem, I went to Cairo, and Greeks were living in Damascus. There were Greeks as far as Tehran in Iran. So, what we today think of as Greece was just a very small part of what was the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, as it's popularly called. And even after the creation of the modern Greek state, more Greeks were living outside of Greece in the Middle East, what is today popularly considered the Middle East, than inside what is Greece today. So again, the Greeks really transcended this kind of East-West boundary. And that's what I tried to kind of get out of the book.
Okay. Now, you've mentioned it's a travel book, and you mentioned that you go to sort of parts of the world that are sort of melting points / fault lands, areas where traditionally there was a larger Greek community. You've mentioned that you decided to do that because you wanted to show those communities. But what was that journey like for you? Which locations that you visited, what kind of stood out for you, and what did you learn? Because you kind of had this idea and you kind of knew what you're going to discover, but invariably you discovered more.
Yeah.
So what did you discover more in those places?
Well, I'll say this because as a journalist, I'm based in Greece, and as someone who spends a lot of time in the Middle East and traveling between the U.S. and the Middle East, I'm always going from Greece. So my first stop in the Middle East, I always say it's Greece. It's always my departure point. So basically, what I try to say in the book is that it's a land of gradients, the wider Middle East we have to think of. And I'm not the first one to think this. The great French historian Fernand Braudel, he talked about a Mediterranean that was kind of built in concentric rings, right, of cultures kind of overlapping. And he talked about basically an Egyptian culture. This is the ancient Egyptian culture and ancient Greek culture. And he said that all these kind of countries, which we today consider part of the Levant or the wider Eastern Mediterranean, they had these overlapping cultural, political, and social tendencies as far back as the ancient times. So I'm not the first writer to kind of see this continuum kind of across the wider region. The cities that I honed on in my travels were really obviously kind of the cradles of kind of this cosmopolitan, very sophisticated Eastern Mediterranean that was part of the Byzantine Empire and the Ottoman Empire. So of course, Istanbul, which the Greeks call Constantinople, was the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire. Up to 200,000 Greeks were living in Istanbul when Turkey kind of came into being as a nation state. My travels in Egypt, of course, there was a massive Greek community in Egypt starting in the 19th century. Egypt's a fascinating country because today in the West especially, right, whenever everyone talks about traveling in Egypt, we think about either tourism or migration, right? And today, kind of this notion that everyone who's trying to leave Egypt, right, you kind of have this whole, kind of this crackdown on migration and kind of borders going up and everything. But there was a time when people didn't try to leave Egypt, they came to Egypt for opportunities, actually. So you had, thousands of Greeks coming from Greek islands around the Turkish mainland who were going to Egypt to build the Suez Canal, who were merchants, who were traders. So Egypt was not a place that people tried to emigrate from, but immigrate to, which I think is fascinating. And of course, the Greeks kind of spread out. There were some places that I would have liked to have gone in the book where there were Greeks living. For example, in Beirut, there's still a Greek community in Beirut. There's a small Greek community in Damascus. But I specifically picked countries, and I think this is why it's more than a travel book, that have some geopolitical significance today in the new Near East that we're seeing, this wider Middle East. So I wanted to go to Turkey, and I wanted to ask the Greek community there that still remains, what they thought of Turkey as a kind of a regional power now, this rise that we're seeing of Turkey and kind of the tensions that we see between Greece and Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean. Egypt, again, it's another country that has moved closer to Greece because of the Eastern Mediterranean tension. So Greece has really relied on Egypt to counter Turkey in kind of their maritime dispute. And of course, I wanted to go to Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem, where most of the Greek community lives. That's still there. There's a couple hundred of them. I wanted to go there because of this burgeoning relationship, which is very fascinating, between Greece and Israel, this kind of geopolitical alliance that is emerging. And I wanted to ask the Greeks of the Holy Land, of occupied Palestine, what they thought of that relationship. So there are a lot of countries I could have gone to, but I tried to pick these strategic outposts in the wider Middle East where the Greek communities could tell me something about the changes that we're seeing in the wider region.
Okay, so I want to ask you what you learned by asking those questions, but before we get there, we'll get there soon. I mean, there's this, in your book, you discuss the Near East and you discuss the Middle East, and the idea of the Middle East and the idea that Greece is firmly set in the West. It also suits a narrative which has suited the war on terror. It goes beyond the war on terror. It goes to earlier times when, sort of the West was trying to otherize Islam and co-opt Christians in the Middle East, but not in the heartland of Islamic lands, not in Syria,
the
or
rimlands,
Lebanon.
the rimlands of the Mediterranean. Of
exactly,
course. Yes.
and so they want to sort of co-opt the Greeks, right? So I mean, get to those what you discovered when you asked those communities in Istanbul and Cairo and Jerusalem the various questions. But before that, just if you can talk a bit about how Greece sort of fits into broader plans of Western imperialism. And what they've tried to do with Greece in the region, in the last 100 years.
Of course. Well, this is why Greece is so important. It's not even 100 years, but it's going back 200 years, right? So a lot of people don't realize this, but when we think about kind of the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire, right, and kind of these nationalisms that emerged, right, this quest for the nation states, T.E. Lawrence kind of, riding around in the deserts and the Arab revolt, the Balkans, the breakup of the Balkans, all of that, the kind of the Eastern question, which they called it in the 19th century, right, which is how did the European powers carve out the Ottoman Empire? All of that started with Greece. It was the first country where this started. So the Greek Revolution against the Ottoman Empire, it was a popular revolution in a sense, right? You had kind of the Greek communities who really didn't see themselves as Greeks, let's say. They saw themselves as Orthodox Christians, right? And they called themselves Rum, again, as the descendants of the Roman Empire. So if you told a Greek in 1800 in Thessaloniki, you're a Greek. He said, no, I'm Rome, right? I'm Eastern Christian. They wouldn't know what you're talking about, to be quite honest with you. This Greek identity, which is a nation-state identity, emerged kind of from the Greek Revolution, which was very much influenced by these Western values and romantic writers and these kind of things from London, from Paris, who kind of came in and kind of worked with the Greek rebels. But the story of the Greek Revolution is so critical to understanding kind of how all this starts. So the Greeks, of course, they were kind of angling for there was always rebellion in the Ottoman Empire, right? I mean, first and foremost, this was an empire, right? And the Ottomans were kind of constantly advancing their borders, right? This is why, what's fascinating in the Ottoman Empire, the governors of the Ottoman Empire, there was no distinction between civil and military affairs. So the kind of the governor of one region, he was also a general, right? And that was the whole point of the Ottoman Empire, was to advance kind of to expand these borders. So as any empire, the Ottomans had to deal with kind of local rebellions. Especially this started to emerge in the late 1700s, right? As the empire is starting to fray, as it's kind of losing some of its power relative power to the French, to the British, it has to deal with these kind of local rebellions. The Greek Revolution was really the first revolution that we saw in the Ottoman Empire. And interestingly enough, it didn't start anywhere near where modern Greece's borders are. It started in Moldova. So you had, it's fascinating. It's a fascinating story. You had this group called the Philiki Eteria, which was it was called the Friendly Society in Greece, right? Of Greek merchants, kind of upper middle class merchants, right, who had kind of traveled within Western Europe, and they were kind of starting to get these Enlightenment principles, and they were being told in their trips, right, that okay, you are kind of the descendants of ancient Greece, the Hellenic Greece. We are democracies. Our parliamentary system is based on you guys. And of course, it's very valuable to have an ally like that in the region also, right? So there was, again, it was a genuine movement, right, this Philiki Eteria, this kind of friendly society that was spreading around and kind of trying to promote this idea that Greece, or the Greek-speaking people who are Eastern Orthodox Christian, kind of can create this new state for themselves, right? And interestingly enough, it was led by some very well-off families in Russia, actually. So the advisor to the Tsar, one of the military advisors to the Tsar, Alexandros Ypsilantis, he was a Greek from Constantinople, from Istanbul. He had traveled for his education in Russia, very Europeanized, and he was a military officer. He had this idea that I'm going to lead a revolt and I'm going to recreate the Byzantine Empire. Literally, this is what he wanted to do. So from Ukraine, he crosses into modern-day Moldova, and he kind of proclaims the rebellion in the name of Byzantium. And of course, the revolutionaries get slaughtered by the Ottomans. They get totally crushed. The reason that the revolution started in Moldova, which is very interesting, is that the Ottomans actually had entrusted the entire province to the Greeks. So again, this is something a lot of people also don't realize with the Byzantine and the Ottoman empires, is that when Constantinople fell in the late 1400s, the Ottomans, they needed local rulers. And they needed kind of, a deep state class of people to kind of rule this new empire that they were taking over. And they very much adopted Byzantine customs and culture and tradition. And of course, some of the Byzantine royal family, the young children, they were raised in the Ottoman court, and they became the governors of all these Ottoman regions, which is fascinating, right? So from the late 1400s up until the 1700s, early 1800s, the Greeks were ruling what is today Moldova, and Transnistria, kind of this region, right, the breakaway region there that Russia has. But it was all ruled by Greece, and that's why kind of...
on behalf of the Ottomans.
On behalf of the Ottomans, yeah, they were the governors. And that's why Ypsilantis is like, okay, he's looking for a place to go, and he's like, okay, I can cross in from Russia through here, from Odessa, through Ukraine, which is where the Filikiatoria, this friendly society, started. And he's like, I can come in here and I can proclaim the revolution in Moldova because I have local governors, some friends, people who know me and my family, and I can proclaim the revolution. The revolution collapsed there, but then it kind of filtered over to the mainland areas of Greece, what is today kind of, Athens, people who fly into Athens, Attica, and then the Peloponnese Peninsula. And that's where the fighting really started. But again, as I say in the book, the fighting wasn't this notion of, okay, let's make this Greek state with these borders, here, and this is going to be our capital. It was, we need to recreate the Eastern Roman Empire. There was no national identity kind of attached to that. What happened was the Greeks eventually developed kind of this notion of what does it mean to be Greek, right? Okay, you have to speak the Greek language. You're Eastern Christian. And a lot of this was influenced by, again, Western European countries that saw ancient Greece kind of as their model, right? So the Greeks were crafted into this. And you had this very interesting dynamic between a Western-educated merchant class that was kind of funding the Greek rebels, who was, living in London. They were traveling kind of abroad, and they were taking in money. They were trying to raise loans, of course. It was a big deal. So the Greek merchant families, which really dominated trade in the Eastern Mediterranean, they were responsible for getting financing from London, from the British Empire, to kind of support the Greek rebels against the Ottomans, which was a big change for the British Empire also, because remember, the British were very committed actually to Ottoman integrity at one point in time. They didn't want to see the breakup of the Ottoman Empire because they thought it would empower the Russians. So you had kind of this, you had the British kind of reluctantly entering the fray. And what's interesting about the Greek Revolution, actually, is that it's really the first war where we see public opinion really enter the fray of a conflict. Before that, you had these monarchies fighting, you had the empires fighting. So the Ottomans were competing with the Portuguese in the Red Sea. They were kind of competing with the French and the Spanish, right, in these battles. But there was no public opinion, right? But in the early 1800s, you have kind of this new burgeoning, right, enlightened middle class kind of coming from France and Britain. And of course, they're familiar with ancient Greece and Plato and Aristotle. And they start to get these ideas about, well, we have to help the Greek fighters. These are the heirs of ancient Greece. And the governments in these countries are actually kind of pressured slowly but slowly into supporting the Greeks. Again, because of public opinion, which is really fascinating. Before that, there was no public opinion, to stop or to start a war in Europe or the wider Middle East. The Greek Revolution is, again, a first of many things, but it was the first time where we see that kind of come into the fore. And really the symbol of that is Lord Byron, right, the great poet who had traveled widely in the Ottoman Empire. Interestingly enough, Byron ended up in the Ottoman Empire because of the Napoleonic Wars. So a lot of these kind of upper middle class kind of romantic travel writers of the early 19th century, they would have traveled normally in France or in Italy. But because of the Napoleonic Wars, there was a no-go zone. So they needed somewhere to go that was cheap and sunny and nice. And they were kind of attracted this Oriental vibe that they were kind of romanticizing about the Ottomans. So they all ended up going to what is today modern Greece in the Ottoman Empire. And Byron, who became, kind of like the cause célèbre for the Greek Revolution, he was first and foremost a grand admirer of the Ottomans. A lot of people forget that. And he was really buffeted with kind of the Ottoman courts that he saw, especially in cities like Yanina, which is right on the border today between modern-day Albania and Greece, where Byron traveled. But he was a great Orientalist, honestly, for lack of a better word. And he was an admirer of Ottoman culture, even though he supported the Greek rebels. So anyway, you have these writers like Byron who are coming back, and, the social media at the time, it was books and it was poetry and writing. And these guys were coming back and writing about these rebels and fighters, and that's kind of what galvanized this public support for the rebel movement. But yeah, so you have the Greek Revolution kind of start, and then eventually the Greeks are the Greek rebels basically, they're trying to fight and they're trying to get kind of a foothold in the region, and they're courting the European powers for that. So there is this dynamic, right, between the West and the Greeks, in which they're helping them. They're playing both sides. They each kind of played the same side, right? The Greeks are classic Levantines. So on one hand, kind of they're going to the West to say like, yes, help us because we want this. And the West is like, okay, maybe we want to help you, maybe we don't. And eventually the West kind of sees, okay, we can get involved here, we can intervene. This notion of Western intervention comes from the Greek Revolution also. So it was a dance, it was a dance between the two sides in many ways.
And I think it's important to mention that, like, after that, there's a bunch of interventions. So
very much so.
The Saudis revolt against the Ottoman Empire. It's also part of World War One. Egypt's a bit more complicated because Muhammad Ali Pasha, who we'll come to, because he's got an interesting Greek connection as well. He revolts against the Ottoman Empire. So I'm mentioning these things because this was a Greek revolt against the Ottomans. It wasn't a Christian revolt against the Ottomans, which I think it partly is.
It started as a Christian.
Important.
So it's very interesting. It started as a Christian revolt against the Ottoman Empire. It very much did, because there was no Greek identity, right? So how did you determine it? But at the same time, it's very interesting. When I went in and I was kind of reading for this book and researching it, many of the Greeks at the time, they had the idea that they would take actually as their leader another Ottoman Pasha. So they wanted to throw off the Sultan in Constantinople, and they had this idea that I mentioned the city of Yanina. Yep. There was a guy called Muhammad Ali Pasha of Yanina, a different Muhammad Ali, who was ruling over Yanina, and he kind of had this independent state that he had carved out actually from the Sultan. So he was a governor, but he had a lot of independence. And the Greeks were quite fond of this guy, actually. He had a Greek wife, actually. And he had, he was very close ties to kind of these Greek merchant families. And some of the Greek rebels early in the war, they actually wanted him to be their leader of this new country that they were forming, who was an Ottoman Pasha. So again, the lines were really mixed. And of course, you had deals being cut and backroom dealings between kind of Greek warlords and chieftains and then pashas kind of in the Ottoman court. So it was a very murky world. But what I say in the book actually is that to understand kind of, and this is important for Greece, how kind of Greece sees itself today, I think the modern image of Greece, right? In the West, especially, you have a lot of writers, right? And again, I embrace kind of this cosmopolitan Levant, right? But in the West, you have kind of this notion of, everything was so great in the Levant, right? However, in Greek kind of popular culture, the main writers, think about Nikos Kazantzakis, who listeners are probably unfamiliar with, except for he wrote Zorba the Greek, right? The famous kind of Greek novel, which became a movie. One of his earlier books was called Freedom and Death. And it was a book about the Cretan revolt against the Ottomans in the late 19th century. And this is kind of a blood and guns soaked nationalist kind of book, right? The Greek Christians are rising up against the Sultan in Constantinople, and all of our Greek blood is slain on the island. So there's a lot of folklore, there's a lot of kind of, and that seeps into Greece today, right? Because how do you create this national narrative of a country, which is real, obviously, but there was kind of this kind of broader kind of creation of a nation state. How do you create nation states? And as you said, yes, the Greek Revolution starts. Greece gets its independence. It's recognized as a kingdom in 1832. And this is where it gets interesting. I know you asked about kind of Western intervention and kind of proxy war. This is where it gets very interesting. So the Western European powers eventually intervene in the war, right? In the late 1820s, there's a big battle called the Battle of Navarino, where the Western European powers, Russia, Britain, and France, destroy the Ottoman fleet. And the Greeks are kind of there, and they're sitting here, and they're like, okay, we can get a country out of this somehow. Like, we can make some kind of a state. And of course, the Europeans are like, okay, we've intervened. We've invested a lot of money here. Who's going to rule the country? So they can't give a democracy to Greece, right? Even though that's what the Greeks wanted. So the Greeks actually, their kind of, their ideal was Napoleon, right? Kind of this idea like egalitarianism, freedom. They pulled onto the French Revolutionary ideas and the United States, right? The Declaration of Independence. They were very much influenced by this. But the European powers, right? They wanted to control kind of this very strategic sliver of land here in the Eastern Mediterranean. So they imposed a non-Greek Orthodox king, Otto of Bavaria, on the Greeks. So he wasn't Greek. He didn't speak any Greek. He wasn't Greek Orthodox. And they said, this guy, he doesn't know anything about Greece. The Greeks don't know who he is. He doesn't share any religion with them or any cultural similarities. Let's take him from Bavaria and we'll put him in here, and he can be kind of our proxy, to control Greece. And that's how Greece is born, right? Out of this kind of Bavarian king who's appointed by the big Western European powers. So I think it's important, when we look at kind of all the countries of Western intervention today in the Middle East, right? Whether it's Iraq, Libya, the war in Iran today that the Israelis and the U.S. are waging, all of that, kind of this notion of Western intervention, kind of putting someone in power, it all goes back to Greece. It was the first country within the former Ottoman Empire where that happened. Where kind of what was a popular revolt in a sense was kind of distorted and manipulated, and then you had this intervention from Western powers. So that's why Greece is so important, I think, to understanding the wider Middle East, because all the trends that we see today from Western powers, they all really do go back to Greece.
Okay, now I want to, before I come back to the thing you mentioned earlier on about what the Greeks in Istanbul and in Jerusalem and in Cairo had to say, I just want to build on it a bit more, right? So tell me how sort of the foundation of a Greek state, which is now still in its infancy, it hasn't really been born like until World War I, how that impacts how it will come to impact Greek populations in that's outside of Greece, so in Istanbul and in Jerusalem and in
Yeah.
Cairo and all of these places. So because eventually there's this empire,
Yes.
and there's lots of trade and there's
Yes.
lots of cultural exchange, and then nationalism comes,
Yes.
and then there's forms of ethnic cleansing,
Yes.
forms of migration, forced migration. So
Yes.
just tell me how that impacts culturally, but also what the geopolitical impacts are, like numbers, how many people had to leave, how many people were killed, but then also how that impacts the culture.
Yeah, no, so it's a great question. It's really fundamental, again, to understanding this. This was the Eastern question. So you have a Greek state, 1832, the Greek kingdom is proclaimed, and it's a very fragile state. As I say at the time, it's probably something akin to, in terms of its stability and in terms of its position, like Somalia at the time, right? Kind of this very, very fragile country, which is very, uncertain, and no one knows if it's safe or not. And oddly enough, as I said at that time, more Greeks were living outside of the Greek state than inside of it. And as the Greek state was growing in the 1840s, the 1850s, the 1860s, you had migration away. So Greeks were going to Egypt, which was, again, part of the
They
Ottoman.
were fleeing this.
They were fleeing this, yeah.
This fragile state.
Yeah, this fragile state. Yeah, so like, we got to get out of here. We need economic opportunity. We want trade.
Which is what happens to proxy states.
Exactly.
Because you have everyone interfering it, and you have the traditional foe, the Ottomans, who are also interfering.
Yeah.
Yes.
But again, this was the time, again, this idea of nation states, it really hadn't kind of come into being. So it was a much more fluid region. You didn't have kind of visa, and you didn't have, to worry about immigration custom checks. It was like, okay, I've got a cousin in Alexandria who's a merchant who's trading with the Maltese. Like, I'm going to go there and I can live there. It was a much more cosmopolitan world. You have to imagine this, right? It wasn't so constricted. So again, though, you have this tiny Greek country, and as the Ottoman Empire is disintegrating, right, you have this era of the Tanzimat reforms. The Ottomans are trying to reform. They're trying to kind of westernize their military to kind of hold on to this territory. And the Greek state kind of is emerging, and it's kind of what I say in the book is that the Greece grows by clawing territory away from the decaying Ottoman Empire. So kind of every kind of 10 years or so, you have a conflict, right? And Greece is kind of, okay, they're kind of moving forward, and they're reclaiming these lands, which were part of the former Byzantine Empire. And of course, they were majority Christian, right? Majority Orthodox Christian. By the early 1900s, right, Greece has kind of expanded, and it's battling with these new nation states like Bulgaria, right, and Serbia for influence. And, there's this Albanian nationalism, which is kind of emerging. So all these countries are fighting wars amongst each other too, right, for a slice of kind of the crumbling Ottoman Empire. By 1912, 1913, Greece enters the kind of the final war with the Ottoman Empire before World War I. And Greece has massive gains in this war. So they take Salonika, which is today modern Thessaloniki. Interestingly enough, Salonika wasn't even, the Greeks were third on the list in terms of kind of the percentage of population at the time, in terms of, kind of representation. Salonika was a Jewish city. So it was majority Jewish, Ladino-speaking Jews who kind of came to the city, welcomed by the Islamic Empire of the Ottomans from Spain. They were fleeing kind of repression there, and they came to Salonika, and they thrived there, Ladino-speaking Jews. So they were the biggest kind of percentage group you had there. Behind them, it was Muslims. It was kind of Turkish Muslims and Muslims from the wider Balkan region. And then, last but not least, on that list, it was Greek Orthodox kind of, speaking Greek, who were starting to identify again as Greek, right? Because by this time, by the early 1900s, you have nationalism, and they've kind of cemented this identity. But Thessaloniki wasn't a Greek city. It was majority first Jewish. It was a Jewish city. Also, I mentioned Yanina, which is kind of on the border with Albania. Kind of the Greeks had kind of taken that. Some of the Eastern Aegean islands, right, that people know today, like popular tourism spots, Chios, Lesbos, Samos, kind of these islands which you can get a direct flight to from London, cheap for the summer. These were very Ottoman islands up until the collapse of the empire. So again, the Greeks kind of take Chios, Lesbos, Mytilene. They take these. Crete has joined Greece, right? But the Greeks face a dilemma when you get to World War I, and this is fascinating, right? Because again, at this time, there's this kind of tussle between the two sides of where do the boundaries and borders of Greece stop and start, right? Because if Greece's claim to kind of this nation state is based on this ancient Byzantine Empire, well, then you have to go all the way to Constantinople. You have to go to Istanbul. And there's the big divide that's emerging within Greece at the time because, as I said, right, early on, the territory that Greece was kind of claiming from the crumbling Ottoman Empire, it was majority Eastern Orthodox Christian, Greek-speaking, right? So they didn't have a problem. But by 1912, 1913, a lot of the territory that the Greeks had taken was very mixed. Thessaloniki, for example, right? Yanina, the regions of Macedonia and Thrace, kind of on the border with Turkey, right? You had Bulgarian minorities there. You had, a wide swath of Muslims who had been living there for centuries under the Ottoman Empire, right? So the Greeks weren't in the majority in these places. And there's a divide that's emerging within Greece in Athens, which is old Greece, right? Kind of this, by now kind of solidly part of the West. You had kind of neoclassical architecture going up, kind of this Hellenic, spirit. And interestingly enough, it was the westernized Greeks who were very, very reluctant to march further and take more territory, which I think is very interesting. So for them, these regions that the Greeks were living in, like Thrace and Macedonia, they were, kind of as oriental and as exotic, I think, to someone in London as it was for someone in Athens at the time, right? And the Greeks kind of had these interesting customs, right? Because the Greeks, like the Athenians, kind of looked down on these Greeks as being like, I have nothing in common with this guy. He has more in common with the Ottoman, Muslim subjects of the Ottoman Empire than he has with me. Why would I want to, have this guy, this merchant at Thessaloniki, join my country? So there's kind of this conservative element actually kind of within Greece, which says, no, stop expanding our borders. We need to stay here, like within this kind of Western cocoon that we have. Interestingly enough, it was, however, the Greek minorities that were living in the Ottoman Empire that were kind of clamoring kind of for this broader vision of Greece. Because remember, as the Ottoman Empire was crumbling, and I think this is important, the Greek merchant classes were actually expanding their power. So they're getting very rich, very wealthy. And, the bankers, the Sultan's bankers were all Greeks. Some Armenians, and they were mainly Greeks, right? So there was kind of one strand within the Ottoman Empire at the time among Greeks that said, wait a minute, why should we even carve up the Ottoman Empire? We're taking power from within, right? Because the Greeks controlled all the trade from cities like Smyrna, right? Today, modern-day Izmir. The Greeks were, all around these rimlands of the Mediterranean. The Greeks were the ones who controlled most of the trade. So the idea for them, which was that, why are we going to carve up this state and kind of unleash this? We can take power from within the Ottoman Empire, potentially. And again, this goes back to kind of the Young Turk Revolt, right? In the early 1900s, kind of with this promise of like Ottoman democracy or an Ottoman parliamentary system, many of the ethnic minorities in the Ottoman Empire embraced that vision, right? Until kind of you had this nationalism that takes hold of the Young Turk movement and kind of imposes this very clear nationalistic line on what it means to be Turkish, right? But early on, it was the minorities that supported this movement because they kind of saw themselves as really empowered in a decaying Ottoman Empire, which I think is interesting. Anyway, when the war comes together, the Greeks have to make a choice. So it's do we join the Allies, who are historic protectors, right? Great Britain had always been the great patron of Greece, and France, or do we sit on the sidelines and kind of wait it out? Greece's king at the time, King Constantine, was actually in favor of waiting it out, which is interesting, I think. He was a Germanophilic ruler, so he was very close to kind of the German Empire. He kind of saw himself as a Bismarck figure, let's say. And he didn't want to enter the war on the side of the Allies, which is interesting. And this is the kind of the conservative view of Greece. The liberal, small L liberal, right, like the Lloyd George kind of British kind of liberal, which was like we have to advance kind of our liberal principles in trade and commerce, was really epitomized by this leader called Eleftherios Venizelos. Venizelos was kind of the national icon of Greece. He was from Crete. He became prime minister, and he was pushing for this expanded vision of Greece. They called it the Megali Idea, which was a big idea that you would kind of recreate the Byzantine Empire, and that the Greeks saw the Ottomans as weak, and Venizelos said, we can take Constantinople back. We can get it. And the Greeks believe this. We have a fighting chance at it, so we have to join the side of the Allies. What's interesting, of course, is that the Greece eventually, it does join the side of the Allies in 1916. The Allies by then had already run roughshod over Greece neutrality, right? Yeah. So the French had kind of landed an army in Greece, and they were fighting the Germans there. The British basically occupying kind of parts of Greece, even though the Greeks were neutral, interestingly enough. You have this split in Greece between the king and the prime minister, and Greece kind of descends into two governments, right? So the king is saying, no way, we're not advancing anymore. I don't want to control these territories, which are very Eastern kind of to him and Oriental. He's like, I want to just stay in Athens and I want to focus on this. And the Germans might win the war, right? Who knew at the time? Venizelos is the prime minister. He's very close to Britain. And of course, he has British backing. He kind of leads a putsch and he kind of takes power, and Greece enters the war on the side of the Allies, of course, right? The rest is history, right? The Ottoman Empire collapses. But that kind of really sets the stage for what is kind of the final Greek entrance to try to take back these lands of the wider Middle East, which is basically modern-day Turkey, right? Which is the Greco-Turkish War. So from 1919 until 1922, you have this brutal war being waged. Greece kind of gets concessions from the great powers to occupy Smyrna. They come in there, they start taking out the coastal areas of Asia Minor, where there were Greek communities, of course, right? Living, historic Greek communities there since the times of the Roman Empire, really, honestly. But again, you have this mixed population of Greek Orthodox Christians and Muslims, and you have Turkish nationalism starting to emerge, right? And obviously Ataturk kind of comes to the fore. He was a military commander in the Ottoman Empire. He rallies kind of these forces of Turkish nationalism, and he pushes the Greeks back into the sea, basically, right? And you have this catastrophe in Smyrna, the burning of Smyrna to the ground, this ethnic cleansing of the Greek community there, which, interestingly enough, again, very common today in the Middle East, the Western powers who kind of had pushed the Greeks into intervention and said, yes, we've got your backs, we'll supply you, we'll give you arms. When they see Ataturk kind of coming to the fore, they abandon their proxies, right? And the Greeks are cut off. So first they lose Italian support, they lose French support, and then finally the British stop supporting them. So the Greeks were kind of nudged into kind of taking these territories in Asia Minor, with the idea that eventually they'd be able to take Constantinople. But again, Ataturk kind of comes in and he cuts deals, right, with the big Western European powers, and he's able to kind of defeat the Greeks. And that is kind of the collapse of where the borders are today of Greece, honestly, right? So kind of, that dividing line between Greece and Turkey, it's because of 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne, which ended the Greco-Turkish War. But this idea, again, of kind of a Byzantine Empire reincarnate, even at the time of nationalism, right, it's still kind of lurking in Greek consciousness that where should the modern borders of Greece be? Well, because it's based on the Byzantine Empire in this idea of Orthodox Eastern Christianity, our borders should expand as far as Eastern Orthodox Christians live, right? So it's very interesting comment. You have this very interesting dynamic between, nationalism and kind of this older empire kind of, feeling.
Okay. We're going to come back to your geopolitical question, but I think understanding the history kind of then allows us to understand the geopolitical reality a bit better. So how devastating are the population exchanges that occur after the Greco-Turkish War? And then how does that further impact Greek communities that are not, living in Turkey, that are living elsewhere in the Mediterranean basin?
Yeah, extremely devastating. I mean, again, this was a Levantine kind of entropole, the region, right? So you have about 400,000 Muslims living in modern-day Greece who are sent back, ethnically cleansed out of modern-day Greece and sent to Turkey, and about 1.4 million Orthodox Christians living in today modern Turkey who are sent to Greece. Staggering numbers, right? Interestingly enough also, right, again, the Treaty of Lausanne, how did they determine who was going to be a Turkish citizen and who was going to be a Greek citizen? Again, it did go back to religion, actually, right? So you had a situation where you had Turkish-speaking Christians in Asia Minor who didn't speak Greek, right? They were sent to Greece. They didn't speak a word of Greece, but they were Turkish-speaking Christians. Same in Greece, honestly, right? So you had in Crete, for example, you had kind of you had Greek-speaking Muslims who didn't speak Turkish, who are sent to today. Many went to Syria actually, but then also some went to Turkey. So you had this. It was all based on religion, right? So that's how they would divide it up. Again, kind of going back to this notion of the Byzantine and the Ottoman empires, kind of in this historic Eastern Orthodox empire. But it was very devastating, right? I mean, you had, for the most part, the Ottomans had allowed this beautiful coexistence between the two sides, right? And despite, what I say in the book is that you can't let the last 100 years of kind of fervent nationalism, right, from kind of the mid 1800s up until World War I, kind of cloud how you view the Ottoman Empire, because for centuries it allowed this beautiful coexistence, right, between these communities that were living there. And as I said, right, Greeks were the bankers to the Sultan, so you had kind of this, business interest mingling. You had coexistence and cosmopolitanism under the Ottomans, and the population exchange, again, backed by Western powers, kind of this state-sanctioned ethnic cleansing, kind of ended that in a sense. What is interesting is that there were two communities, and again, this is why I went to Istanbul. There were two communities that were left out of the population exchange. The Muslims who lived in Western Thrace at the time, which was kind of Greece's border province with Turkey, they were allowed to stay in their homes. And today I've traveled there for Middle East Eye, and for this book I've also I made a few trips to Western Thrace. You have, out of a population of about 350,000 people in the province, 1/3 are actually are Muslims they consider themselves, most of them identify as Turkish today. But Greece considers them, interestingly enough, Muslim citizens of Greece, is what Greece, kind of the technical term of how they define them. And then in Istanbul, the Greek community there was allowed to stay for two reasons. One is that the Patriarchate, the Orthodox Patriarchate, is located in Istanbul. I went and I visited Patriarch Bartholomew for the book. And the Western European powers were kind of nervous about, wait a minute, if we take the Greek community out of Istanbul, what does this mean for the Patriarchate? And then you have a whole other question, right? How do you relocate one of the ancient seats of the Christianity in the Middle East? So the Greek community was allowed to stay also in Istanbul, about 150,000 or so, who were, I'm sure we'll discuss it, right? There was this kind of bout of nationalist ethnic cleansing in the 1960s against the minority. But those were the two communities that were allowed to stay, interestingly enough. There were two hangers-on. Everyone else had to go. And it's funny, in the book, I cite a great line from The Bastard of Istanbul, the novel by Elif Shafak. And she has a great line from one of her characters who turns out to be the Armenian stepsister of a Turkish girl in Istanbul. And it's a great quote in the book that I put out there. And the Armenian girl is telling her Turkish stepsister, why are Turks in constant denial that they're part of the Middle East? And she goes, if you would only admit it. And then the Armenian says, and if Turkey had let us stay in our homelands, we would be part of the Middle East too, instead of being a diaspora community. And what I say in the book is that line actually, to me, it epitomizes Greece on both sides of it, right? So on one hand, the Greeks were driven out of the Middle East, what we consider today the Middle East, by the nationalist powers, right? Kind of this ethnic cleansing that was sanctioned, right? So geography determines so much, right? Which is interesting. Kind of in the West, we determine whether you're part of the Middle East or not by where this line was drawn by some colonial guy, or whether you're part of Syria or Lebanon by a colonial line. So on one hand, right, the Greeks were pulled out of the Middle East. And at the same time, right, there was this Western kind of drive within Greece at the time to kind of, Westernization effort, right? So like the immigrants who came to Greece from the kind of the lands of the Ottoman Empire in the 1920s and the 1930s, they had to leave, right, their Middle Eastern kind of traits and their language skills at the door, which was a big shame, right? So you had, up until the 60s and 70s, honestly, there was kind of this exodus of Greeks from the wider Middle East to modern-day Greece. And they had to leave their language skills at the door. Many Greeks spoke Arabic. Spoke Turkish, and kind of the Greek state and kind of Greek culture was, no, now you're part of the West, so you have to drop all those skills at the door. So I say it was a double tap, basically. The Greeks were kind of pulled out of the Middle East by the West, and then the Greek state, which was trying to Europeanize and Westernize, kind of wanted to suppress that Greek Middle Eastern identity as well, which is very interesting. And it's a legacy that continues today, right? It's why a lot of Greeks, I always sometimes end up apologizing to Greeks who say, you're saying we're part of the Middle East, it's like an insult. And I'm like, no, it's a good thing. Stop it. This is your asset. This is the value of kind of Greece, right? In this multicultural world that we're living in, especially in the wider Middle East. This is an asset for Greece. But again, that legacy really goes back to the population exchange and kind of the pullout of Greeks from Turkey.
Tell me now about the Greek communities in Egypt and in Syria and in Lebanon and in what is now Israel. Occupied Palestine, and just how they then get impacted by what occurs in as a result of World War I.
Yeah, well, so it's interesting. So the population exchange that happened between Greece and Turkey, obviously, it left out a lot of these Greek communities that were living in Syria, modern day kind of. At the time there was no, there was no the Palestinian Mandate, exactly. French colonial Syria and Lebanon, and then Egypt, right? So they were exempted from it. Actually, a lot of Greeks actually went from Asia Minor to these places. So the Greek populations in places like Beirut and Damascus and Halab, Aleppo, also in British Mandate Palestine, they swelled, they increased. Because the Greeks in Istanbul, not in Istanbul they were exempt, but the Greeks in Asia Minor felt they had more in common with, kind of with the Greeks living in Beirut or Damascus.
And the Greeks living
than Athens. So I'm going to go to Beirut, and I've got a cousin there who's got a great shop or a business opportunity. Also Egypt, right? The Greek population of Egypt swelled after 1923. Also, we should remember this. Greece at the time was very, very poor, right? So Greece had fought a years-long war against the Turks. It was bankrupt. There was no money in the Greek state. So why would you go to this country that's very fragile, that just carved out its borders, that's got, 1 million refugees living there. No one has housing. The Greeks are like, it's a lot better to go live in Cairo or Alexandria or Beirut.
And, which has been part of the Ottoman Empire
now
for 300 years.
And it's very comfortable for them, right? So, yes. 20 years ago, your father could have been traveling to Beirut and back in Izmir the next day. Not the next day, but, within a week of travel. So, so honestly, the Greek communities in these areas swelled actually after the war, which is interesting. And they were exempt. And in the book, basically, so I went to Egypt. I met the Greek community in Egypt today, which today it's about 2,000. You have about 2,000 Greeks living in Egypt from a number of 200,000 in late 1940s. Really, it hit its peak in the 1940s. The Greek community. This community is interesting because actually at the time, I know we want to talk about Muhammad Ali Pasha. The Greeks obviously started migrating. Well, the modern Greeks started migrating to Egypt in the early 19th century. When Muhammad Ali was kind of the ruler of Egypt, and they came for economic opportunities. So kind of you had this trade, kind of burgeoning trade. Muhammad Ali had opened up Egypt kind of to commerce. He did a lot. He was kind of really trying to invest in Alexandria. He kind of wanted to really promote Mediterranean trade. This was his big beef. He built a big kind of idea. He built a canal linking the Nile to Alexandria so that there could be more trade, and he was kind of promoting cotton industrialization, and the Greeks saw opportunities there. The building of the Suez Canal in the 1860s kind of it opened up a lot of opportunities for Greeks to come and do the construction. The Suez Canal was built by Greeks, honestly, from places like islands like Rhodes. They came from as migrant workers. So the Greek community in Egypt had swelled and continued to grow all the way up until 1920, through the 1920s, through the 1930s even, and it hit its peak in the late 1940s. Palestine also had up to between 10 and 20,000 Greeks were living in historic Palestine, which I think a lot of people don't understand. There's an Armenian neighborhood in occupied East Jerusalem. So a lot of people kind of envision, okay, there's the Armenian community there. But there were up to 20,000 Greeks living in historic Palestine, which is a huge number, right, at the time, given the population. And of course, there's the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate there, but they also went for work. Greeks were working as, honestly, technocrats for the Ottoman Empire. So they were managing the railways, telegram systems, all of this kind of stuff, with the Greek traders and the ports, kind of the coastlines. So that community was there, 20,000. And I wanted to go to both of those places, right? I wanted to go to Egypt to meet the Greek community because I wanted to ask how they kind of saw these changes. Interestingly enough, what I said in the book is that, I think this is something, again, another lesson for the wider Middle East. As I traveled, I saw these lessons for the wider Middle East. And it's the dangers of listening to diaspora communities sometimes, right? I think we've learned this from the Iran war, right? The Iranian diaspora. But, in the U.S., for example, you have a Greek, I am Greek American, but, most Greek Americans kind of sense this, that the Greeks are persecuted in Istanbul, that, there are no Greeks left in Cairo even, right? Kind of most Greeks of the diaspora assume. Whereas the Greeks in the diaspora, as I said, they go along and they get along a lot better, right? So in many ways, those divides kind of between Western Greece and Oriental Greece that were kind of, bubbling in the late 19th century, they still exist today with these communities. I said in the book that the Greeks of Istanbul were the Greeks of Egypt were the best drinking companions one could have. So I went for mezze and for beer with the Greek community. They have a Greek club in the center of downtown Cairo. So Talat al-Harb Square, which people who know Cairo, it's really the heart of it. There's a Greek club right there. A lot of people don't know it. They have a beautiful vista, actually, a beautiful club. And the club is very popular, interestingly enough, with the Egyptians. So popular, in fact, that the Greek community is expanding it, they told me. So there's only 2,000 Greeks left, but they're making a franchise out of it because it's so popular with Egyptians. And I would say Egyptians from all walks of life also, right? Secular and religious, which is fascinating. And again, there's something about this kind of Greek, I think, mentality that Egyptians are very drawn to because of this kind of similarities in their cultures. So the Greek club is very interesting there. Interestingly enough, when I was in Egypt, I met one guy. I should say this. The Greek community, how did the Greek community of Egypt die, right? I mean, that's important because there was no population exchange, right? The Greek community, as I said, it swelled in the 1940s. 1952, you have the coup against the monarchy, right? Gamal Abdel Nasser kind of leads this military putsch. He proclaims, the Arab, Arab nationalist, right? Military commander. And at the time, right, he was talking about nationalizing all these assets. So Egypt, it's very interesting. In many ways, Egypt, as I say in the book, kind of the nationalism that kind of took hold in Egypt was very similar to the nationalism that took hold in Greece, right? So the Egyptians were kind of trying to figure out what is their identity, in the post-war era, right? Because Egypt was this country ruled by this guy, Muhammad Ali Pasha, in the 1800s. He really created the modern state of Egypt, right? He came from Kavala, which is a Greek port city. He was ethnically Kurdish, most people think actually, from central Anatolia. He comes to Egypt, modern-day Egypt, in the early 1800s as part of a military force to kick out Napoleon, who had invaded Egypt, kind of in his bid to kind of get to the Red Sea. He consolidates his power, and he kind of gives birth to this dynasty of what I call kind of Ottoman pashas of kind of Albanian, Greek, Kurdish descent, who are marrying Circassian harem women, and they're speaking French and Turkish, a very multicultural kind of, ruling class, right? That lords above, obviously, Egypt's fellahin, who are kind of, slaving in poverty, kind of in the cotton fields, and they're totally disconnected kind of from the economic engine of life, right? So his kind of, this Oriental, Westernized, monarchy is kind of sitting atop all of this, right? And of course, in between that, you have kind of Armenians, you have Greeks, you have Italians who are, they're not upper class. Many of them are middle class, right? They're working as your mechanic in the garage. They're working kind of at the butcher shop, and they're kind of small business owners and stuff. And this was really the Greek community, right? So you had kind of this banking class in Greece, like Alexandria, which is really kind of, to understand that, you can read like Lawrence Durrell, right? The Alexandria Quartet, which kind of captures this cosmopolitan spirit of Alexandria in the 1930s with kind of Greek bankers and Syrian bankers wheeling and dealing. But most Greeks, the tens of thousands of them who were living in Egypt in the 1920s and 1930s, were just ordinary people, right? Kind of working in their shops, kind of mechanics, as I said. The real technical skills the Greeks had, and that's why they came to Egypt. Anyway, when Nasser comes to power, the Greeks face a question there. And it's, well, how do we fit into this new Egypt, right? Which, again, is nationalizing. Because, what does it mean to be an Egyptian? If you're speaking Greek, you can't be an Egyptian. Of course, Nasser was secular. So, again, he had this very, very rigid kind of concept of what it is to be an Egyptian, right? You have to speak Arabic. And the Greeks, he didn't kick out the Greeks per se, but it was kind of, as one of the Greeks in Egypt told me, it was kind of this de facto expulsion, right? As Nasser nationalized kind of all the Egyptian assets, the middle classes that were kind of there, they got driven out because there's nothing they can do. And Nasser imposed these quota systems, right? So that you could only hire an Egyptian, right? So the Greeks kind of lost their jobs there. And by the 1960s, you have tens of thousands of Greeks leaving Egypt, basically. So it was a de facto expulsion is the way it's explained to me. The 2,000 or so Greeks who still live in Egypt, a fascinating community. one still owned a textile factory that his great-grandfather started. And I was curious about this, and I asked him, and I'm like, how do you still have this factory, right? Because I'm like, I thought Nasser nationalized everything. He goes, it's a long story. And he goes, my great-grandfather was a really lazy guy. And when the British, obviously Egypt was part of a British mandate, right? When the British were here, they wanted to celebrate one of the princesses coming from London on a honeymoon trip or something. And they said in Port Said, you have to put out the Union Jack. And my great-grandfather was, he was having night of drinking, and he was lazy. And he's like, I'm not putting out the Union Jack for these Brits. So he goes, my great-grandfather's arrested. Hilarious. By the British, for kind of, they think he's a nationalist, right? Like this Greek merchant, and he's like sleeping one off. And he goes, my great-grandfather's arrested. And he goes, so Nasser came to power, and he heard the story. And as he's nationalizing all the textile factories, he goes,
you keep yours.
He goes, there's a Greek that stood up to the British who wouldn't follow the Union Jack. He's like, I got to meet this guy. And he goes, so Nasser, when he kind of ordered the nationalizations, he said, this guy, Yanni or whatever, he gets to keep his factory. So I met the great-grandson of the guy who still has the factory, interestingly enough, and it's through all those years. So again, a community like that, right? Lots of stories. They've really seen the ebb and flow of history in the region. Unfortunately now, and again, this is one of the things I try to talk about in the book, I didn't want to just kind of focus on the history, but I wanted to ask these communities, where do they fit in the wider region today, right? Like the geopolitical trends, right? So Egypt today, obviously, is controlled by Sisi. The economy is a mess, right? Egypt's been hit really hard. Obviously, you have the human rights issues, but you also have this economic issue. This is what the Greeks care about, to be honest with you, because again, the Greeks came to Egypt as traders and merchants. So a mismanaged economy, right, in which kind of the military controls all the assets and everything, that really there's no place for the Greek community there anymore. So the Greek community is not persecuted in any way, but because of the economic crisis, right, and they're footloose, right, so they have Greek passports. If they want to leave, unlike many Egyptians, they can go. So unfortunately, I say that in my assessment, kind of in the next decades, we're going to see kind of, I think, the last flame of the Greek community of Egypt, simply because of the mismanagement of Egypt's economy. They're going to leave. So the Greeks came for economic opportunities to Egypt, and the economic crisis by Sisi is going to drive the last of the Greeks out. Very similar, honestly, to Turkey, the same thing. Kind of this inflation crisis that we're seeing in Turkey. There's no persecution in Turkey. In fact, the Greeks, are having a renaissance in Istanbul because of Erdogan, interestingly enough, right? Who's kind of this populist kind of Islamic figure who kind of espouses the Ottoman Empire. The Greeks have flourished there culturally, but the economic crisis there is so bad that many of the Greeks, again, who are footloose and they have the opportunity to leave, dual citizens, they're probably going to go to Greece as well. But anyway, so the Greek community is still there in Egypt. Everyone should go to the Greek Club who travels to Cairo. And then I wanted to go to Israel, right? As I said, there were up to 20,000 Greeks living in Palestine at the time. So I spent most of my time in occupied East Jerusalem. There's roughly 100 Greeks left in Jerusalem, which is a tragedy. It's funny, I say in the book that of everywhere I traveled in the wider Middle East, to Turkey, to Egypt, and to Israel, kind of these classic occupied Palestine and Israel, it is the Greek community in Israel, which is actually the biggest shell of its former self, which I think interests a lot of people. And that is one topic that kind of, having the book's been well reviewed, people kind of bring up to me in conversation, is that, I'm really surprised that, the Greeks of Turkey are kind of, culturally flourishing. The Greeks of Egypt, they have this economic problem, but, culturally it's fine. But it's the Greeks in Israel, right, who are really the shell of the former selves because of Zionism. Arab nationalism and Turkish nationalism, kind of in Islam itself, right, the religions, the predominant religions in Turkey and Egypt, are much more accommodating to the Greeks than Zionism, I think, which is the big lesson from my travels in occupied East Jerusalem. The Greek community there, it's a shell of its former self. Most Greeks left in 1967 after Israel occupied East Jerusalem kind of and took the West Bank. That's where many of the Greeks were living. And today, obviously, a lot of the church lands are under dramatic attack from settlers. You see this in East Jerusalem. You see there's a beautiful school in East Jerusalem, which is it was a seminary school. It was built in the Ottoman times, and today it's a high school actually for Greek students, and it's all the expenses are paid. Interestingly enough, so if you're from Greece, the Patriarchate runs it, the Orthodox Patriarchate. You can kind of come to East Jerusalem and you can study. This school is attacked constantly by settlers, right? So the Greeks, as I say in the book, the Greeks of occupied Palestine, they really have no place in Israel today, which is the tragedy.
Tell me more about that community. What were they like? What were their fears? And juxtapose it with the community of the people you met in Istanbul and in Cairo.
Yeah. Well, so I'll give a great example. In Istanbul, it was very easy to kind of go to these cultural venues, cultural clubs, kind of, which really sprung up kind of in the Ottoman Empire in the late, in the late eras of the Ottoman Empire in the 1920s and 1930s. You had all these community clubs, right, kind of which were burgeoning. In Istanbul, it was very easy to kind of go and introduce yourself. And of course, in Cairo, there's the Greek club right in the center, the beating heart of Cairo. In Israel, there's nothing like that. There's a Greek club. It's shuttered. It's closed. Kind of the community is fighting amongst themselves. But what I said is that basically Zionism really has left no place for kind of this multicultural the kind of identity which would embrace, obviously, the Palestinian persecution and the genocide in Gaza. But even in East Jerusalem, there's no place for kind of this cosmopolitan identity of yesteryear, of the Ottoman Empire, in which the Greeks flourished. Of course, the Greek community is very much tied to the Patriarchate today. The Patriarchate is under relentless attack in many ways from Israeli settlers who are trying to take a lot of the land. People don't realize this. The Greek Orthodox Patriarchate is one of the largest landholders in Israel. It actually rents the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, the land that it's built on. Most of the land for the Patriarchate, it's tied up in very opaque Byzantine, let's say, 99-year leases that kind of came about when Israel was created in the 1940s. I think the Jewish Fund kind of, they kind of signed a lot of these contracts and they kind of forced kind of the sale of these properties. So again, a lot of the Greeks are tied to the Patriarchate, which is under relentless attack. I went to Israel. I was in Jerusalem recently for last Easter, and everyone in the community was talking about a raid that Israel conducted on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre the previous Easter, and they actually dragged the Israeli security forces actually dragged out the bodyguard of the Greek council from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and it's still left to chill in the community that there's a raid during Easter service on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So you see kind of this Israeli, the occupation is felt very deeply there. And of course, one thing that's also interesting, as I said, in Egypt and in Turkey especially, you have a lot of mingling between the Greek minorities that are there, kind of in the Arab Egyptians, Muslim and Christian, and Turks. In Israel, I didn't sense that. In fact,
and it's a tiny community. So
very tiny community, 100 people. Yeah, it's a tiny.
So they just literally.
Yeah, exactly, amongst each other, right? And the Palestinian Christians. I mean, you have mingling with Palestinians, but you have no mingling with Jewish Israelis, which is fascinating, right? I mean, it's very different. So again, as I started to say in the book, is that Palestinian Christians especially and Greeks, there's a lot of symmetry. There's a lot of intermarriage, interestingly, between Palestinian Christians and Greeks, which didn't happen as much in Egypt, I will say. So there's something about.
Is it because the community is bigger, or is it just because?
I think it was just cultural, honestly.
Okay.
But there's a lot of intermarriage between Palestinian Christians and Greeks up until like the 1940s. So there was a lot of intermarriage, a lot of intermingling. Again, with Jewish Israelis, there's really no interaction, which I think is very interesting, especially given this relationship that we see geopolitically between Greece and Israel, which I think would surprise a lot of people, right? That the community there is very isolated kind of from the Israeli Jewish community. So again, it's a community that's under a lot of pressure. The few that are still there, right, they survived the 1967 war. Basically what happened was, the Greek, it was called the Greek colony during the British Mandate era. And there was a very burgeoning kind of flourishing Greek community. It was in West Jerusalem. Really beautiful kind of, the limestone villas that were built in apartment buildings, kind of a burgeoning merchant class, which was really coexisting again, right, with the Palestinian Muslims and Christians, with Armenians. When Israel was proclaimed and during the Nakba, all of those houses were seized, as were Palestinian houses, right? The Greeks suffered the same evictions by the Zionist militias, right? So in West Jerusalem, you see kind of all these Greek villas and houses that were seized by Zionists, taken over. The Greeks were forced into East Jerusalem, obviously, which was controlled by Jordan at the time, and kind of they lived there. And then once the Israelis conquered East Jerusalem and they took the West Bank in 1967, many Greeks from there also fled back to Greece. So again, which is interesting, and I think a lot of people don't realize this, that the Greeks have the same history of displacement as the Palestinians who are living, and the Armenians, right? Zionism is so totalitarian in how it kind of believes what you should be. It makes no excuse, right? Whether you're Muslim or Christian, it doesn't differentiate. And a lot of people,
Palestinian.
Exactly, yeah. And a lot of people don't realize that. Interestingly enough, so it's funny. One of the kind of the anchors of my book is the Greek Jerusalemite scholar P.J. Vatikiotis. He was really like a father of Egyptology. He was one of the co-founders of SOAS in London. He was Greek Egyptian. His grandmother was Palestinian. And he wrote a beautiful account of his father's last days in Jerusalem during the Nakba. And he kind of talks about it's interesting, as I say, the Greeks were really good. I always found the Greeks good guideposts to understanding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because the Greeks were there. They had tried nationalism and kind of this like totalitarian, this nationalist idea. They had tried this. It didn't work out too well for them, right, in 1922, 1923. So they're observing kind of the nationalism of Palestinian nationalism and then Zionism, and they're kind of caught, right? Like, where do they go? P.J. Vatikiotis, who wrote this beautiful book, he shows that the Greeks, obviously, they came down on the side of the Palestinians, of course, and that when the Zionist militias were coming to West Jerusalem, it was Palestinians who came to this, his father, he writes, to his father's house saying, flee with us, please. We're taking you with us. The Zionists are coming. So I think that for me, that was kind of resonated very much, that the Greeks were just as much in the crosshairs of the Zionists, and the Palestinians actually came to some Greek houses and said, we have to go. There's no place.
I guess they saw them as neighbors and not as settlers.
Yeah. Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm guessing the small community that's still there, they're there because there's land that's theirs, and they have a a relationship with the land.
Exactly, and many of them work for the patriarchate also, right?
Okay.
This is the the Orthodox patriarchate there. It's sprawling. As I say, actually, the Greek Orthodox the Greek flag you see on every Orthodox kind of church building in Jerusalem. It is pretty prominent still, so you do see that. So you do feel the Greek Orthodox patriarchate in Jerusalem. Many Greeks work for that. Others work as tour guides, things like that. But again, you don't feel them as much part of the fiber of the community as you do in Egypt, in Cairo, or in Istanbul especially.
Okay. Now let's move to the geopolitics. Right. So you mentioned Greece has an increasingly strong relationship with Israel. I think that's the heart of the question, right? So tell us about Greek fears about Turkey rising continuously as it's got a much bigger army, a much bigger economy than Greece. Where Greece is looking for an allies, why they looking for allies, etc. What's going on?
The Greek-Israeli relationship, as I say, we cover this so much Middle East, the Abraham Accords agreements, right? And one of the things that I say is that the Abraham Accords, in a sense, overshadowed what is a very monumental kind of alliance forming in the Eastern Mediterranean between Greece and Israel, and a very dangerous one, in my opinion. Something that, honestly, in my opinion, could spell the end of NATO. I think you have this triangle of conflict between this old conflict between Greece and Turkey, which is kind of there. It's always bubbled under the surface over the Eastern Mediterranean, more so today, right? The last two decades, Greece and Turkey have kind of been in this spat over the maritime zones. In many ways, this is kind of like an arcane conflict, right? Like, they're fighting over kind of these exclusive economic zones that maybe they have gas deposits there or not. The Greeks are staking out their claims. The Turks have their claims. And, until recently, that was kind of where the feud was. Enter Israel, right? And now you have a third party to the conflict, which, as I write in the book, and many people are concerned about this, has a kind of a vested interest in potentially provoking a conflict between Greece and Turkey to kind of to collapse NATO, right? I don't think
NATO and to weaken Turkey, yeah.
Exactly, right? So that is the danger. But the Greek-Israeli relationship itself, I think we could take a step back. It's a very fascinating relationship. And again, I think it surprises a lot of people. Greece was the last European Union state at the time to actually establish full diplomatic relations with Israel in the 1990s. Greece was the last state to do it. Greece also was the only European state at the time, again, European in quotes, to vote against the UN partition plan for Palestine. So Greece has always been very much on the side of
and the reason for this was because of their traditional relationship with the Greeks.
With the Arab, with the Greeks, with the Arab world, honestly.
Okay.
So you had remember in the 1940s, you had 200,000 Greeks living in Egypt, right? Okay. So the Greeks don't want to support the Zionists, right? Because they're intermingled and mixed with the Arab population.
So they culturally saw themselves as part of the region.
Even in the 1940s, and they had vested interest again, the business interest as well,
so
right?
The same reason the Lebanese didn't.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. But but again, this speaks to kind of this multiculturalism, right? And these connections, these lines between the two sides. And of course, Greek shipping interests were at stake here, right? So the Greek ship owners kind of saw Saudi Arabia rising as an oil producer, and the last thing they wanted to do was offend the Saudis, right? So again, there's these kind of business interests, cultural interests, the Orthodox Church, which was very powerful. Zionism would dilute the power of the Orthodox Church. So the Greeks were very much in line with the Arab position in the late 1940s, which was rejecting the Palestine partition plan. Anyway, Greece over the decades, it has very good relations with the Palestinians. A lot of people don't realize this. Palestinian resistance fighters especially, many of them kind of lived in Greece and went back to Lebanon in the 60s and the 70s. Arafat was a very good friend of Andreas Papandreou, who was the Greek prime minister, kind of a socialist firebrand. When the Palestinian resistance fighters were forced out of Beirut in the 1980s, it was actually Greek ships that brought them to safety. And that was because the Palestinians trusted the Greeks more than anybody else, which is interesting, even in the retreat. And again, a lot of the Palestinians who kind of were kicked out after the Nakba, this ethnic cleansing, many also settled in Greece. A lot of people don't realize this. Consolidated Contractors Company, CCC, it's one of the largest construction companies in the Middle East. It's owned by a Palestinian Christian family. It rivals like the Bin Laden Group. It's massive. It's based in Athens. Wow. And that is a legacy of the Nakba, to be honest with you. So a lot of Palestinian Christians also ended up in Athens. Kind of in the decades after the Nakba, which is very interesting. So Greece had all these ties to the Palestinians, kind of in the Arab world. They were very reluctant to kind of engage with Zionism. Obviously, in the 1970s, Egypt kind of establishes diplomatic relations with Israel. The Jordanians do in the 90s, and then Greece kind of enters the fray in 1990, early 1990s. Greece establishes this diplomatic relationship with Israel. But again, it's a very frosty relationship, geopolitically, let's say, right? The Greeks really don't have much to engage the Israelis on. Interestingly enough, the big breakthrough in the relationship came in Russia. So in 2010, the Russians brokered a meeting between Benjamin Netanyahu and the Greek prime minister at the time, George Papandreou, who was the son of Andreas Papandreou, which is very interesting, right? Kind of the socialist firebrand who was like, friends with the Palestinian fighters and kind of, supporting them. His son meets Bibi in a very fancy Moscow restaurant, kind of under the auspices of Russian intelligence. Kind of impromptu meeting, we'll both be at the same time. And they kind of forged this kind of relationship. And again, it goes back to Turkey, of course. At the time, right, Erdogan, he has closed Turkish airspace to the Israelis. Remember, there's the Mavi Marmara incident. So you had this Israeli attack, yes, right? The killing of the activists, and Turkey's kind of relationship with Israel kind of becomes frayed. Interestingly enough, right, it was Turkey, which was the first Muslim state to kind of really form very deep relations with Israel. The nationalist kind of secular generals who oversaw Turkey, they were allied with the Israelis. And interestingly, right, again, it's the Turkish-Israeli relationship, which is working in Washington throughout the 70s and the 80s, and even into the 90s, defeating things like the Armenian genocide bill. So the Israelis actually helped the Turks defeat a genocide bill against the Armenians, which would have recognized the Armenian genocide bill, right? So the Turks had the Israeli lobby kind of effectively working for them when it was kind of ruled by the secular kind of, right, military dictatorship. Erdogan comes to power. And again, Erdogan comes to power in the early 2000s, but it's not until 2010 that we have this real break, right, between the Turks and the Israelis. And again, it's over Mavi Marmara. And then obviously you have the Davos incident, right, where Erdogan kind of storms out in his interview and he says he's not going to be treated like this. So the Israelis are starting to get nervous because the Israelis also relied on the Turks, right? Israel is a small country. We all know this, right? It's boxed in by Egypt and Jordan, two countries that have peace treaties with Israel. But obviously the sympathy for the Palestinian cause is very deep in Egypt and Jordan, right? So the Israelis know that they can't train in Egypt and they can't train in Jordan, right? And you need to run sorties. Where do you train your fighter jets? Where do your pilots practice, right? If you want to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities, where do you conduct those exercises if you're Israel? Well, you used to conduct them in Turkey, right? Up until 2010. Once that airspace is cut off by Erdogan, the Israelis are looking to the Mediterranean, and they say that Greece has kind of, right? Obviously, Greece is a small country, but it has a lot of territory because of its islands. So they start going to the Greeks. Of course, then kind of Cyprus gets into the mix, right? So Cyprus kind of develops this relationship with Israel, also kind of a tripartite kind of relationship, Greece, Cyprus, Israel. You have kind of Israeli troops training. You have in one area of Greece, you have a flight training school the Israelis run, right? So it's a military relationship that deepens. And again, it's all motivated by Greece kind of thinking the enemy, this is the enemy of my enemy. It's going to be a good friend of mine. Very, very dangerous relationship, in my opinion, right now. And what we're seeing, is basically the Israelis kind of Israel becomes more isolated, let's say, right, in the Middle East, right? I think it's latching onto that Greek relationship more. And it's kind of trying to pull it to the side, right? Because you see kind of, Saudi Arabia's distance itself from this idea of normalization, yes, right? Ties with Egypt aren't so good. So the Israelis are looking for friends. They need the Greeks very much, right? And they want to show that they're not isolated in the region, right? In fact, I interviewed actually, his name is Eran Lerman, one of the advisors to Netanyahu in the early 2010s, who was kind of the architect of this relationship, which was a fascinating interview. And he said, I always knew that Israel needed this kind of Mediterranean alliance because we need to kind of we need to show that we are not so isolated. And the Greeks and the Cypriots allow us to do that in many ways. So Greece has a lot of leverage with Israel, despite kind of this military imbalance, obviously, right? Israel's nuclear on power. Greece doesn't have nuclear weapons, but there's an imbalance here in terms of like prestige, right? In diplomatic relations. But anyway, that's really where the relationship goes. It kind of comes from Turkey, from the Greek side.
Do you think it's sustainable? Do you think the fact that Israel is becoming increasingly isolated, there's a lot of discontent over its genocide. Yeah. So do you think it's sustainable? The pull factor is immediately fear of Turkey, right? It's like the push factor is fear of Turkey. But do you think that's still sustainable?
No, I don't think it is. So it's interesting. I'll give one anecdote here. In the book, one of my guides is Lawrence Durrell, obviously the travel writer, and Durrell in Alexandria Quartet. He envisions this plot. So Alexandria Quartet, it's a beautiful series of books kind of about Alexandria in the 1930s. There is a geopolitical story hidden in there. And Durrell kind of envisioned this world where, as the British Empire is crumbling, right, the Coptic Christians make an alliance with the Zionists. And that's actually the geopolitical story behind Alexandria Quartet. A lot of people don't kind of realize that, who haven't really devoured the book, but that is at the heart of it. And as I say, as America's pulling out of the region, what we're seeing is the Greeks kind of looking to the Zionists for allies. In a similar way to how the UAE has actually done it, right? The UAE is kind of trying to look around and they're kind of forming this relationship with Israel. The Greeks are doing in a similar sense, right? There's some echoes of it there, right? The Greeks are saying that America is not so interested in the region anymore. we need an ally, we're going to the Israelis. And of course, the Greeks are betting that the Israelis will keep the Americans engaged in the Eastern Mediterranean, right? That's the big bet. It's the Israeli lobby. As I say in the book, right, is that kind of the backlash that we're seeing because of the genocide in Gaza and kind of because of Israel's occupation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem in the West against Israel, that is not a sustainable bet in the long term. So maybe it seems like a good bet now, but in 5 or 10 years from now, I think it's a very dangerous bet. The other angle that I have, and this is something that I think Greek diplomats and officials who are in the know are starting to understand more, 5 years ago, if you had asked the Greeks about the Greek-Israeli relationship, they would say something like, Israel is going to protect us against the Turks. Israel's this powerful military, right? Because Israel seemed invincible, right? In a sense, right? 10 years ago. So if anything ever happens and America doesn't come to our aid, well, the Israelis can step in or we can have this kind of relationship with Israel. Now, as we've seen kind of Israeli aggressiveness all across the region, and we've seen setbacks for the Israelis in certain places, the argument isn't whether Israel will protect them against the Turks. It's, will Israel drag us into a war with Turkey? Right? And that is the danger. And I think some people are becoming familiar with it. Again, it's not something that you hear publicly. And my concern is that Greece, in a bid to kind of keep the U.S. engaged in the region as the U.S. pulls out, is going to double down on that relationship. But I don't think it's sustainable, because this is the crux, right? Israel at the time, right? The Greek-Turkish relationship we have to discuss a little bit, right? And kind of this the feud between them over these maritime zones and exclusive economic zones that they have. So the Greeks and Turks have been rivals in the Eastern Mediterranean, right, for decades, kind of since these kind of two nation states emerged. In many ways, it's an arcane dispute. There are some serious points to it, right? This battle over exclusive economic zones, which kind of determine your maritime territory in which you could exploit subsea resources, like fish farming, natural gas potentially. That's something that could probably be negotiated. Greece and Turkey are also locked in a feud over their territorial waters, right? So under the UN law of the sea, countries claim up to 12 nautical miles of territorial waters. Greece in the Eastern Aegean has demarcated 6 nautical miles around its islands. Turkey has a casus belli against Greece if Greece were to extend those to 12 nautical miles, which Greece reserves under the UN treaty. Yep. Turkey says that obviously this is not. Turkey says that they dispute this and say that the islands can't grant you that. Most international laws and norms do grant that you have 12 nautical miles. This is interesting enough the same thing in the Strait of Hormuz, right? This argument between Iran and Oman, right? This notion about a transit zone and fees, it goes back to 12 nautical miles. Yep. Right? So that 12 nautical miles is key, and that is a very dangerous part of the feud between Greece and Turkey, and it is a serious issue. I think more serious than the exclusive economic zones that probably get reported more. But anyway, up until recently, what I say in the book is that Greece and Turkey kind of have these nationalist medias and these press, right? They kind of delight in the feud in a sense, right? It's funny. It's like they're addicted to it. It sells newspapers. It gets clickbait. In the 1990s and the early 2000s, you kind of saw Greece and Turkey would ratchet up ties. The medias would kind of go at it. In 1996, they came very close to war, actually, over the island called the Mia Kardec incident. They were very, very close to war. The Clinton administration intervened at the time and kind of pulled its two NATO allies away from each other, and it fizzled out. Now, the problem is that America is less interested in NATO, and you have a country like Israel, which, because of its tensions with Turkey, is vested in seeing the demise of NATO.
Escalation, yeah.
Exactly. So you have a third party to the Greek-Israeli rivalry, which is very interested in potentially having an escalation in the Eastern Mediterranean. And that is my concern, and I think that is something that, as we kind of see this new order emerging with America kind of less interested in the region, especially NATO, let's say, right? Because, as bad as NATO's expansion was in Eastern Europe, NATO did some good things. And one thing it did is prevent a war between Greece and Turkey, in my opinion. And it kind of kept the status quo in the Eastern Mediterranean. As the U.S. pulls out and as NATO looks shakier, what does it mean kind of Israel has a vested interest in kind of breaking apart NATO? The easiest place to do that is actually in the rivalry with Greece and Turkey.
How did the Greeks in Istanbul and the Greeks in Cairo feel about the Israeli and the Greeks in occupied Palestine feel about the Israeli and Greek relationship?
Well, so the Greeks in occupied Palestine had a fantastic leader with a man named George, who's he's the community leader of the kind of the Greek community in occupied East Jerusalem. And as he said in kind of a beautiful passage, he was saying, there's been this race to Europeanize Greeks for centuries, right? And he goes, everyone was telling us to be like Aristotle and Plato. And he's like, I'm not Aristotle. I'm like, I want to be a Byzantine, basically, he said. And he goes, the West keeps telling me to be that. And he goes, sadly, because we're such few in number, the Zionists could just squash kind of, any vestige of kind of the traces of Greek kind of, identity, kind of this cosmopolitan identity in East Jerusalem. And no one would know, right? Because it's so few. Most people in Greece don't even know that there's a Greek community in Jerusalem, let alone in the West, right? So unfortunately, they feel very, very fragile in occupied East Jerusalem. The community in Istanbul, I think, was one of the most fascinating that I met. Because in many ways it challenges, I think, a lot of the assumptions, especially in the West, that people have kind of about Islam, about Christianity, about coexistence and cosmopolitanism. Interestingly enough, right, it was the secular government of Turkey that persecuted. I think it surprised many people in the West. It won't surprise Middle East Eye readers, of course, but I think your generic reader will be very surprised by this. It was the secular kind of government of Turkey that persecuted the Christians in Turkey. So in the 1960s, you had this mass expulsion under the CHP, which is kind of Turkey's secular main secular party, of Greeks from Istanbul. Tens of thousands were forced to leave. And there was this big persecution all the way up into the 80s and the 90s of the Greek community there. Whereas one old gentleman had told me, we were afraid to speak Greek on the street, actually, under the nationalists and the secularists. Erdogan comes to power, and again, because he kind of is espousing this broader vision as a populist figure, right? He actually embraces, because of his Islamic religion, his identity, he embraces this cosmopolitan identity, and he says, no, coexistence is the key here. And Erdogan gives a lot of cultural rights, actually, to the Greek community. So the Greek community there culturally is flourishing. It's under Erdogan that we've seen a lot of rebuilding of the churches in Turkey, actually. Not under the secular government. They were the ones that were closing them. And again, that's something that I think surprises a lot of readers of the book who aren't maybe devotees of Middle East Eye, who are so familiar with the region, it's going to educate them, I think, a little bit about this, which is valuable. And that's why the community was so interesting to me. And that, I had one writer friend from Istanbul. She's a Rum Christian. The Greeks of Istanbul still identify as Rum, actually. Again, adhering to this Eastern Orthodox Empire. She said that, all of my friends in the West are like, you're a woman and you voted for Erdogan. How could you? And she said, I like Erdogan. He's giving me more rights than the secularists. So that's a very interesting community in many ways. And again, I found that the Greeks of Istanbul were probably the best judges of Turkish domestic politics that I had met. Because on one hand, Turkey is so divided, much like the US, right? It's so polarized as a society. Kind of between supporters of Erdogan and kind of secularists, and this battle between the identities. Whereas here you have the Greeks, 2,000 or so of them, whose families have been in Istanbul. Many of them are, they lay claim for centuries to being in Istanbul, who are, Greek Orthodox, and they're kind of observing the two sides, right? So there's a great anecdote that was told to me where one Greek gentleman, it was after Erdogan had converted Hagia Sophia back from a museum into a mosque, right? Hagia Sophia, obviously, it was the Byzantine cathedral. It was a church originally. It was built as a church. When the Ottomans conquered Istanbul, they converted it into a mosque. Ataturk turned it into a museum. Erdogan converted it back into a mosque. Yeah. One gentleman that I had met, an older gentleman, said that he went to visit some secular Turkish friends, and he goes over to have a glass of wine with them, and they're like, it's such a shame what Erdogan has done to you people. And they go, and he goes, well, he's like, it wasn't Erdogan she goes, it's such a shame what Erdogan has done to you people. How many of you are there left? And he goes, well, there's only about 2,000 of us. And they go, what? He's driven all of you out. We thought there were 10,000 of you left. What has he done to you? And he goes, it wasn't Erdogan who did this. It was your party that did this to us in the 1960s. It was the nationalists and the secularists, right? And this fervent nationalism kind of, which was really the death knell to cosmopolitanism in the Levant. So that struck with me, that conversation. And even for secular Turks, I think they were surprised. But anyway, as I said, I think the Greek Orthodox of Istanbul were the keenest observers of Turkish politics because they're not driven by this divide, right?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're kind of, it takes an outsider sometimes to see it, but they also know Turkey, obviously. They
of course, and also they will remember the people who kick them out.
Yeah.
Like everyone does.
Yeah, exactly. But also they're very good. They have a bird's eye view, right? They're in the insiders, outsiders, right? As the Greeks were in many of the regions. That's why the book was so fascinating, I think, to understand the wider geopolitical changes. Because the Greeks are insiders, outsiders, right? They have this one foot kind of in the Middle East. At the same time, right, they have Greece, which is part of the European Union and NATO. Most of them are, dual citizens. So they have great perspectives, kind of, and they're great analysts. And I remember I was in Turkey before the election, and one Greek friend told me that Erdogan was going to win the election, the recent election. And he goes, look, if Erdogan doesn't win this election, I know nothing about the country that my family has lived in for 3 centuries, which was interesting, I think. But I will say this, one of the things that really did come up, the Greeks are concerned about, you do have this military, the nationalism, I think, and here's how I put it. In Greece, you have a nationalism, but in Greece, you have a country of 10 million people with an average age of 40. In Turkey, you have obviously we've seen the crackdown on the CHP by Erdogan recently, and you kind of have this bigger country, 90 million people. I think a lot of the Greeks are concerned about this mismatch in military might, where what would happen is, basically, not that Turkey would ever invade Greece or the Greece would ever attack Turkey, but that potentially you could have this brinkmanship game, right? Where something goes wrong and someone kind of pushes the envelope too far. And if the U.S. isn't there to intervene again, to protect its NATO allies from each other, what would happen, right? Because things could spiral very quickly, especially with an outside power like Israel pushing them together. So I think people do take the threat of a conflict between Greece and Turkey. Again, not intentional on either side, but kind of this escalation trap, potentially, with outside powers intervening. People take that very seriously in Istanbul, in Athens, and in Egypt.
Okay, I mean, we've talked a lot about the politics now, and we don't have to stop talking about it. So please, if you want to talk about it more, please do. But I just want to sort of come back to, because I think what's been not being lost, but what we haven't maybe focused on enough is just how is the cultural similarities, right? And your book actually starts with the cultural similarities.
Yes.
There's two sort of examples that play out in my head. The one's right at the end of the book and the one's right in the start. All right, we'll start at the one at the start because I guess that makes sense. But you basically had like a club in Athens. I think it's in Athens,
Yes.
a neighborhood in Athens, and most of the Greek girls are belly dancing.
Yes.
And tell us about that, and tell us about other examples of this. How Greeks often refer to themselves, and Arabs often refer to Greeks as brothers and sisters culturally. Yes.
Well, so music is a great example, right? And actually, so the belly dancing that I kind of discussed in the book, I take it back to kind of this Greek tradition of rebetiko, which is kind of a Greek, it's not classical music, it's kind of a pop music of the early 1900s that emerged, of all places, in the port cities of the Levant, right? So in Smyrna, today Izmir, in Alexandria, in Beirut, and it was kind of this music that used to, like, very, for lack of a better word, again, Oriental kind of, right? The Greeks would sing about camel caravans and all of this stuff, but it was Greek, and the Greeks were singing this. Of course, Arabs also have the same songs, and Turks have the same songs. So kind of this belly dancing kind of, genre goes back to rebetiko, which is this Greek traditional music of the early 1900s, and it kind of flourished. Interestingly enough, this music, it was, again, this kind of drive to westernized Greek society in the late 1960s and 1970s. Greece is governed by military dictatorship, and the dictatorship actually banned this genre of music because they said it was too Oriental and it was drawing Greeks kind of back to the Middle East, and they wanted to impose this Hellenic identity, right, on the Greeks. So they banned the music. Of course, it only made it more popular. Like anything, when you ban it, people want more of it, right? So that music was banned. But again, what I said in the book, and again, Patrick Leigh Fermor, who's a great British travel writer who I cite often in the book, he said he first encountered rebetiko kind of as he was walking in the 1930s along the Black Sea to Istanbul. And he tried to describe it to a British audience at the time in his travel writing. And he said, basically, it's critics would be wrong to call it not Greek, and they'd be wrong to say it's Middle Eastern. He goes, it's Byzantine. And that's kind of where kind of the motivation for the title came from. It was from Patrick Leigh Fermor kind of describing this belly dancing music, actually. So there's all these cultural similarities that the Greeks share. Of course, even aesthetically, I would say, Athens itself, for people who've been there, they'll realize this immediately. It looks like another city within the wider Arab world, right? I have a friend, friends from Lebanon will take photos on the streets of Athens and kind of play a game, guess where you are, Beirut or Athens, and most people can't guess which one because they're just so aesthetically similar. Because again, in many ways, Athens was built very similar to how the cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, Alexandria and Beirut were built, right? You had kind of you had refugees from kind of these nationalisms that were emerging, right? And people flooding to the city centers. So how is Beirut built? Beirut kind of flourished in the 50s and the 60s after the Nakba, right? And kind of you had the Israeli occupation, you had building and booming kind of in the 60s and the 70s in Beirut, similar to Athens, right? Athens kind of was built off the back of migrants and refugees from the wider Middle East. That's how Athens came to be. It's a modern city of the 50s and the 60s. So aesthetically, they look very similar to each other. And a lot of people can't guess the difference in photographs. Also, Gaza, actually. I had a Palestinian friend, who used to show a picture of Gaza before the Israeli genocide and the occupation, the coastline of Gaza and the coastline of Athens, and most people couldn't guess the difference between them, which I think is very telling, actually, right?
It's very telling.
Yeah.
Very telling and very sad.
Yeah.
And then there's the other one is about actually. It resonated with me because I used to live in Damascus once upon a time, and I used to have Baghdad ice cream. But you're basically on this island, which is where your grandfather comes from,
yes.
And you've dropped out of medical school, and you're about to start journalism. And you mentioned, there's few freedoms in the world that you can experience while looking onto the agency.
Yes.
But you yourself are about to start embarking on a journey which you are uncertain where you're going to go. I'm not sure if you decide yet you want to be a journalist, but you are going to Amman.
I had no idea. I knew I had to go to Jordan.
Right, so you're going to Jordan. And there's this thing that comes from trees, and it's mastic.
It's called mastic.
Right?
Yes, it's a resin. Yeah, and it's only grown. So it's very interesting. We should explain what it is because most people know. Our audience probably eats it all the time, and they don't even know, right? So mastic is a resin from this tree called the mastic tree. It's only grown on the island of Chios, which is obviously kind of right on the border with Turkey. Kind of very very. It's a swim away, let's say, right across from Izmir. Mastic obviously goes back to ancient Arabic cuisine. Medieval Arabic cookbooks also describe mastic as a meat marinade. It's used in cuisine all over the wider Arab world, actually. In Libya, it's used as a meat marinade. I think in Saudi Arabia, it's also used. In Halab and Aleppo, I have a lot of Syrian friends who make really nice kebabs marinated in pomegranate and kind of mastic. So it's a great cooking ingredient. Of course, when the Ottomans controlled Chios, it was actually mastic trees were directly under the control of the Sultan's mother, because the appetite for mastic as a chewing gum, because it's kind of sticky, was ravenous, and the Sultan's harem was so addicted to it that the Sultan's mom had to have direct control of the mastic trees, interestingly enough. And mastic is actually one of the reasons, again, going back to this kind of broader cosmopolitan of the Middle East, just real quickly, it's another reason why Chios, before the Greek Revolution, it was one of the richest islands in the Ottoman Empire. And it had a lot of trade freedoms, religious freedom. Chateaubriand arrived in Chios, and he described it kind of as a fairy tale land, the great French travel writer. He was struck by how rich it was and how cosmopolitan the port was. And a lot of that has to do with mastic, because it was a cash crop, and trade around mastic had boomed. So the Ottomans granted this island incredible independence and power, kind of, in terms of culturally, religiously, and economically. Anyway, mastic is only grown on Chios. So I went from Chios to Jordan in 2019, many moons ago, I guess. And I had thought I had left, this was at the time, which of course I had an understanding that Greece, again, I should talk about my family roots. Growing up, I always knew that, okay, Greeks aren't part of kind of the Mediterranean, let's say, of the Catholic world, of Spain and Italy. But I never realized that the roots and the connections were that deep to the Arab world until I started really traveling and working in the Arab world. So I had kind of, I had grown up kind of around ouzo, right, which is kind of the Greek's answer to ardak, or Turkish raki, which my dad would drink. So I knew, okay, they have similar things here, baklava, similarities, but I never knew there was that cultural similarity. Yeah. And of course, in upstate New York, where I'm from, no one knew what Chios was, right? So if I said, my grandfather's from the island of Chios near Turkey, people are like, where is that? It's like Mars, right? When I arrived in Jordan, I told people, they're like, where did, kind of friends the first weeks that I was arriving, Jordanian friends, they're like, where did you come from? And I said, I came from Chios. And they're like, we have to take you to Bagdash. All the mastic that, it's in the ice cream is coming from Chios. So I'm, as I say in the book, right, the friends that I made in Jordan knew more about Greece than the friends that I had growing up in New York State, which I think is very telling about these kind of cultural similarities, and these links that, again, they transcend nation states. They transcend nationalisms that kind of ravaged the region, the wider region in the 20th century. They're much deeper.
You say that the nationalism that ravaged the whole region in the 20th century, it's ravaged a lot. But I think it's just so... when you think about this, if you try to look at this from a 500-year perspective, from a bird's eye view, it's so obvious that there was this big empire and there were these big multicultural cities, Istanbul, Cairo, a bunch of cities on the coast of what is now Israel and Lebanon. And so Greece is quite close to all of them. And so naturally there would be migration, and there'd be trade, and there'd be cultural assimilation and cultural familiarity. And it's just a recently imposed 200 years, but really a 60-year imposition of a forced identity.
In the last 70 years,
Yes.
and it's funny, and I quote in the book, actually, not interesting, Lord Curzon, old British colonial administrator, he has a beautiful quote, actually, about the Mediterranean. Interestingly enough, Curzon, who was called the most traveled man who ever lived in the British Empire, was opposed to the creation of Israel in Palestine. Because he said it would just destabilize the entire region. And he had a quote something along the lines of that the Mediterranean has never been the barrier between these regions, it's always been the connector. It's the connector, right? And again, historians like Fernand Braudel, who kind of wrote about these kind of concentric rings overlapping the Mediterranean and these cultures that kind of spread out from the region, they saw this continuum between all of them. And it really is only in the last 70 years, the post-war era, let's say, from 1945, that really kind of imposed these hard lines. And you brought up the war on terror, and I think that, quote unquote, the horribly named war on terror, let's say. One of the things that I think has done a lot to crystallize that is the West very much trying to otherize the Middle East and to kind of, make it a target, right? So this idea that, okay, the Middle East is Islam is bad, we have to attack this notion that, kind of wage war on a region, right? Whereas you had coexistence between Muslims and Christians for centuries under these empires, and that the region itself is very cosmopolitan and very mixed. So the West tried to kind of inflict this kind of other identity and separation on the region, which I think is the real story, honestly, behind the book. And as I said, that's why the travel was so important for the book, because I had to show this coexistence between all of these communities that existed, right, under various empires, whether it was Byzantine or Ottoman. And again, still today, again, in Egypt and in Turkey, you have this coexistence between the communities that still call these cities home. The book, in a sense, very much is a book about cities, I say. And there's a great quote by Braudel, actually, where he talks about the Mediterranean really being the history of the Mediterranean is really a history of cities in many sense, right? Because it was cities that defined the Mediterranean and kind of this mixing and mingling within them. Alexandria, Beirut, Gaza was very much a part of this as well, right? Haifa, occupied Palestine today. These areas that were very much kind of multicultural, trading pots, entrepôts, where all these kind of communities mixed and mingled, and there was no national identity there.
How do Greeks see this? Greeks today living in Athens or in other parts of Greece, how aware are they of this imposed identity, which is now sometimes their own as well? Like, I mean, how
So
do they see
one
it?
of the things that I would say is I think the financial crisis in Greece, which obviously really devastated Greece, I call that a turning point, 2015, 2016. I think 2015, 2016 was a turning point for the wider region. Of course, you had the victory of Donald Trump kind of in the White House. But this is a turning point because, from the 1970s up until then, right, Greeks were told that if you join the European Union, if you adopt, right, if you kind of, you give the drachma, the Greek currency, you take the euro, you're pulled to the West, everything will be better, right? It's like nirvana, right? It's the promised land. 2015, 2016 comes, and Greece is devastated by an economic crisis akin to like the U.S. Great Depression, right? I mean, horrible. And ordinary Greeks have still not recovered from that, despite the fact that cities like Athens are booming because of this influx of hot money, which we should discuss also. It's very fascinating from the Middle East. But anyway, you have these booming cities in Athens, but you have kind of this impoverishment of the Greek middle class, which is a legacy of the financial crisis. So I think a lot of people kind of grew kind of disenfranchised with this message that, oh yeah, the West is kind of, where everything is good, and if you leave the Middle East behind, it's bad. Again, you still have this otherness, you kind of have this racism that kind of lingers, which is that, well, if we're part of the Middle East, it's bad, we don't want to be that. But it's changing. I see that especially in younger generations of Greeks, and interestingly, in older generations. One of the things that I was traveling in my book, I found, friends' grandparents who still use phrases like, mashallah. When they see a little baby, I say in the book, in northern Greece, you'll hear that in villages. Greeks also have, which is very interesting, I think a lot of kind of incantations to God, I say, that people exclusively and falsely associated with Islam, just as much tied, especially the Orthodox Christianity. The Greeks have their own version of Inshallah, which is prototheos, God first, basically. So there's a lot of kind of incantations and things that are, I think, cross these language barriers that are very similar between Islam and Orthodox Christianity. And one of the things I try to say in the book, which I think is one of the most interesting elements I hope people pick out of it, is that actually Greece belongs to the Middle East because it's an Orthodox Christian country, right? Not in spite of that. I don't want anyone to come away with that, thinking that, this is an Orthodox Christian country that can't exist in the Middle East. No, Islam and Orthodox Christianity especially coexisted, right, for centuries in the Middle East. In fact, when Istanbul was falling to the Turks, the Ottomans, in the late 1400s, the last Grand Duke of the Byzantine Empire, he had a great phrase where they're telling him, they're like, we should call in maybe the Western Europeans to help us. And his name was Lucas Notarias, and he said, I'd rather see the Sultan's turban than the Cardinal's tiara in Istanbul. And as I said, right, once in the Ottoman Empire, the victory of the Ottoman Empire kind of across the Eastern Mediterranean in the 15th and 16th century, it was a golden era for the Greeks, actually. Greek merchants flourished and trade flourished, and the Greeks in the Ottoman Empire, right, under the Caliph, what was the Caliphate, they were much freer than they were under, say, the Venetians or the Genovese trading empires, the Catholic powers. So again, there was this idea of coexistence between Orthodox Christianity and Islam, and Orthodox Christianity is as much a part of the wider Middle East as Islam, and that's one of the things I try to argue in the book. The other part that I talk about in the book, one thing that's very interesting, migration wasn't really the main focus of this book because I didn't want to condense Greece into being part of the Middle East because of migration. So much has been written about it. I wanted to show that Greece has these other ties, right, that people haven't thought about.
Much deeper.
Cultural, much deeper, right? But I interviewed a lot of migrants who came to Greece, especially from Egypt. And one of the things that always stood out to me in migrants that I was interviewing, whether it's in Athens or cities like Kavala, which is the birthplace of Muhammad Ali Pasha, is this idea that people felt very at home in Greece because it's so similar. And I would ask people, I'd be like, if you're a worker, you're a tradesman kind of from Egypt or something, you can make a lot more money if you go to France, probably, right, get a higher salary. And he goes, Greece feels like home to me. So a lot of migrants that I met felt very at home in Greece because of these cultural similarities. I give one anecdote about traveling to a house party in Athens. An Iranian family that had moved to Greece, and they put out heapings of food on your table, and they brought out their grandparents to say hi to everybody at the party who were living with them. And my Greek friends looked around and they're like, well, this is just like a Greek house party. So there's this family, right? The importance of family, these small C conservative values, I say, right? Not political, but kind of cultural. The small C conservative values of family, religion, tradition that the Greeks share, which are very, very similar to the wider Middle East and to the peoples of the Arab and Muslim world.
You mentioned hot money, and you mentioned that things have changed since 2015, 2016. Tell us about that. Tell us how Greeks feel let down by Europe because of the failure of the economy, and how hot money, and where's the hot money coming from, and how it's impacting the way society in Greece is functioning. Yeah.
So the idea of hot money kind of coming into Greece, I think people who come to Athens or they travel there, Athens, I call it another boom city, really, of the Eastern Mediterranean. And there's some lessons there that people should watch. The Eastern Mediterranean in the last 200 years had three great boom cities: Alexandria, Beirut, and Izmir. I say Athens is kind of the fourth great boom city, a neoliberal boom city, let's say. Of course, we know what happened to Izmir, right? 1923, it was kind of the victim of nationalism. Beirut boomed, actually, right? on the back of kind of the Nakba, honestly, right? Because you had all this Palestinian money and kind of Palestinian diaspora that was forced out, ethnically cleansed from Palestine, and they had to put their money somewhere. They had to invest, and many went to Beirut. That's why the boom years of Beirut are the 50s and the 60s. So you had this building boom kind of in Beirut. And of course, Alexandria the same, right? The boom years of Alexandria were the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. And all those kind of, Alexandria fell to nationalism. Beirut, obviously, is under a horrible siege now. But Beirut also fell during the Civil War. It's never really recovered. Athens, I say, is the next kind of like boom city. In many ways, a lot of the money that's coming into Athens today is coming from the wider Middle East, which is interesting. And I think that is one of the lessons. So
like Gulf money, or
no, it's Levant from the Levant. So you have Egyptian money. A lot of Egyptians investing in Athens today, right, because of the currency crisis. So if you're an Egyptian kind of middle class person, and you have $200,000 to kind of an apartment in Egypt, and you're concerned about it being held in Egyptian pounds, right, with the inflation crisis, well, you would sell that and you would buy an apartment in Athens to preserve your capital, right? Same as Turkey, kind of, which is very interesting, kind of as Erdogan has kind of cracked down in many ways, and kind of, especially we see this is the CHP issue, he sparked this big issue, kind of this big influx of Turkish money to Greece, which is interesting. So a lot of Turks are investing in cities like Thessaloniki and Athens. Huge influx. In Lebanon as well, a lot of Lebanese, because of Israel's war in Gaza and kind of war in Lebanon, a lot of Lebanese are taking their money out of the country, and they've invested in Athens. And of course you have Israelis, which is the interesting trend, which I say is kind of the most the difficult issue, because in Israel what you have is a lot of Israelis who are opposed to Netanyahu, who are still Zionist, who are buying in Athens apartments. They live in Athens, they work in Israel, they go back and forth. They're very isolated in their communities. And of course, the Israeli salaries are much higher than Greek salaries, and they're getting priced out of the local. Greeks are getting priced out because of Israelis. And it's a huge issue that Greece has to address, a massive imbalance. But you have this boom kind of in these cities like in Athens, and to a lesser extent in Thessaloniki, but mainly in Athens, of hot money from the wider Middle East coming into the region. So I say actually that Athens, in my opinion, it's kind of the neoliberal, localized version of what we saw in Beirut in the 60s, Alexandria in the 50s, and in Izmir in the early 1900s.
Okay, I mean, Sean, it's been a fascinating conversation. There's a lot more in your book. Is there one thing which we haven't discussed yet, which you kind of want people who are listening to this to maybe understand from your research, from your writing, from writing the book, from an observation which may not be in the book, but that that came to your mind as you were figuring this out?
I think what I want to say is that, like I said, I think especially for Middle East listeners, many people don't associate Greece with the Middle East. But again, I think that if we look historically, as you were speaking, kind of this longer term view, Greece was always seen as part of the wider Middle East, and it's so critical to understanding the region today, not just because of all these cultural similarities that I'm talking about that I find fascinating, but if you want to understand the big tailwinds that are coming in the region, I think you have to look towards Greece. We talked about kind of this rise of nationalism in Greece in the 19th century, and how that sparked really kind of this breakup of the Ottoman Empire, right, from Bosnia all the way to the Arab Gulf. Greece was the first country. After World War II, Greece was also the first country of Western intervention. Greece was descended into a horrible civil war, which sparked the Truman Doctrine, right, of the U.S. kind of intervening in the global South in these conflicts against the USSR, but mainly, right, kind of proxy wars that the U.S. was waging across the global South. Greece was the first country of post-war American intervention. So Greece is oftentimes a country of firsts, because it's a borderland, right? Because it's kind of got one foot in the east, one foot in the west, and it's a swing country in many ways. So I think to understand where the region is going, and when you look at, we talked about kind of global capital, when you talk about an affordability crisis and kind of the movement of money and how people in the region are kind of dealing with these broader issues, right, of kind of governments that are mismanaging their economies, of kind of like inflation even, and what cities in Athens are kind of like reflecting in terms of investment, all of these things kind of, in a sense, you can see in Greece. Greece very much is kind of a mirror for the wider region. So I think, take Greece kind of from a broader perspective, see it as part of the wider Middle East, and also kind of fight back against this notion that we have to otherize the Middle East in terms of, kind of these stark divides between Islam and Christianity, which many people want to promote, right, to kind of drive sectarianism and conflict. They're not only compatible, but they are integrally linked, right? Especially Orthodox Christianity and Islam. There's so many more similarities than differences. And I think this is something that Middle East Eye readers obviously are aware of. But I think in general, we need to kind of, see the region more so in that way, especially as we prepare for a region which is less linked to the U.S. kind of, right? As the U.S. kind of loses its staying power in the region, this broader kind of retreat, American intervention in the war in Iran, we're seeing the region in many ways kind of rekindle these older links. And that's one of the things in the book that I really wanted to communicate is that, older than kind of nation states, older than superpowers, these links, between the Arab world, between Greece, between Islam and Christianity, they transcend, right, superpowers, and they transcend nation states.
Sean Mathews, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, man.
Thanks.